It is just a delight to see so many familiar faces in the audience. Some old friends, some new friends. This adds to the energy level of the entire process. We're glad you're here. I would particularly like to recognize that we do have with us today, we have Bob Stacy. You might stand when I call your name. Go on with each other anyway. Let's do that. Robert Liberty is with us. Thank you for being here. Steve Schell, whom I just spoke with, was on the very first commission. Isn't that an interesting come circle? Larry Gibbons is here. Happy to have you, Larry. Ethan Seltzer, sorry, from PSU. Oh, John Van Landingham, we're so glad to have you back in the room. We wish you weren't sitting back there. Kreb, Dirksall, Dirksen, it's my writing. And Catherine Harrington, I see your lovely familiar face back there too. We also have a number of people that used to work for the department that came back to sort of reminisce a little bit. If you've worked in the past for the department, don't work currently, would you stand up? I want you to stay standing because we want you to say your names.
Is the applause because we left? Or?
Lady Smith.
Rob Zaka.
Yes.
Darren Nichols. Bob Bailey.
Come on, Jim.
Okay.
Jim back.
Eldon Howe. Lloyd Chapman.
Neil Conner.
It's really nice to have you all back. Thank you.
Yeah.
And Charlie Bard.
Councilor Collette is here.
Thank you very much, Charlie. All right. Yep. Oh yes. Colette, you want to stand up? I just figured everybody in the room had your intro today. Thank you again for being here. We are about to embark on a lively panel discussion. We're going to hear a presentation from each of our three panelists and hope that there is time left for the Commission to engage in a conversation with the panelists. I'll turn it over to Rob.
Thank you. For what feels like the 10th time today, I'm Rob Halliburton with the LCD. Good to have one that actually feels good here at the end. Thank you. So we are here to talk about the past, present, and future of land use in Oregon. And we're here to observe the 40th anniversary of Senate Bill 100. And rather than simply commemorating the accomplishments of the many people and communities that have put the act into practice over these 4 decades, we see the anniversary as an opportunity to deliberate on what the future may hold and what we can do and should do to affect it for the better. Our program today includes an opportunity to do just that. We have gathered 3 leading authorities on aspects of the environment in which the statewide planning program operates. The program will focus on the past, present, and future of land use in Oregon. Notwithstanding what your agenda today says, we haven't been making the thrust of this presentation of the land use planning program, but rather of land use in Oregon. We have asked the panel to address the factors that influence the world in which the planning program has operated and how that world is changing, and less on the practices and laws of the land use planning program. Our program includes time for each panelist to impart some findings from their research and the conclusions they've made. Commissioners are invited to ask questions of the panelists as we move through the presentation and not wait till the end. We've reserved what will probably not be enough time at the end for the Commission to engage the panel and each other in discussion, and we expect that you will hear plenty to incite a hearty exchange. To discuss the historical context, down at my far right, your left, we have Dr. Sy Adler, Professor of Urban Studies and Planning and the PhD Program Coordinator at Portland State University, where he's been since 1982. He's worked as a planner for the Los Angeles County Department of Regional Planning for several years after receiving his PhD in City and Regional Planning from UC Berkeley. He's done many studies of planning in the Pacific Northwest, including the Transportation Planning Rule, the Thunder River Gorge National Scenic Area, and concept planning associated with the metro growth boundary expansions. He co-edited and contributed a chapter to Planning the Oregon Way, a 20-year evaluation published in 1994. It's time for a second edition, I think, on that one. And he's also, in 2012, Oregon State University Press published his book, Oregon Plans, The Making of an Unquiet Land Use Revolution, some of which I think we're probably going to hear today. That book is a dissection of the political history of the statewide land use planning program. He's currently at work on a study of planning for the original Portland metropolitan area urban growth boundary and with assisting DLCD in getting an oral history program off the ground. To present the results of some very recent work regarding public attitudes that shape how we think about and use land, we have John Horvick of Davis, Hibbets, and Midgell, the leading public opinion research firm in Oregon. John has 10 years of opinion research experience and has been involved in projects for the Regional Coalition for Clean Rivers and Streams, Energy Trust of Oregon, Metro, and the cities of Portland, Beaverton, Hillsborough, and Lake Oswego. John has worked in different roles on a variety of issues, including youth employment, organizational development, caregiving and aging, and families raising children with behavioral disorders. John previously was a project director at both the University of Nebraska Bureau of Sociological Research and Oregon Health and Science University. And he was recently voted president-elect of the City Club of Portland. To address possible futures, we have Dr. Chris Nelson from the University of Utah. This is a long one. Dr. Nelson is presidential professor of city and metropolitan planning at the University of Utah, where he's also director of the Metropolitan Research Center, co-director of the Master of Real Estate Development Program, and adjunct professor of finance. He's been at Utah since 2008 and on planning faculties since 1984, the year he received his PhD in urban studies from PSU. He's written more than 20 books, 100 refereed articles, and 300 other works, including The Regulated Landscape, Lessons on Land Use Planning from Oregon with Garrett Knopp in 1992. I just had to dig these books out of our library. I figured I had them, might as well bring them. And very recently, published this year, we have Reshaping Metropolitan America, Trends and Opportunities to 2030, which was what caught our eye when we wanted somebody to talk about the future. So prior to academia, Dr. Nelson managed his own West Coast consultancy in planning and management and was for a short time the planning director for Columbia County. So with that, I give you Sy Adler. And I'll take I think I just need to this.
Thank you very much. It's an honor and a privilege to remind you of some ancient history. And it's especially interesting to talk about this stuff in a room full of people, many of whom were very active participants in the events under discussion. So, as Rob said, he asked me to put Senate Bill 100 in context, a larger national context, and I'll discuss these major contextual features: loss of farmland, federal government planning mandates, the changing state-local relationship, and social and political movements. And as I go through each of these major features, I will talk a little bit about how they were manifest in Oregon during the late 1960s and early 1970s. But first, I got to put all of this stuff in a global context. This was my personal introduction to Oregon. So as Rob said, I worked for several years for the Los Angeles County Department of Regional Planning, and I'm driving up to take the job at Portland State. And here's a car parked in a parking lot outside Eureka, California. And here's a car. So you see, Poland has martial law. Oregon has LCDC. So clearly that was a signal. I'd read a little bit about the Oregon program, a little bit about Portland, but this was some serious evidence that people in this state take land use planning very seriously if LCDC is being compared to a communist dictatorship. So that's a global context for what was going on. So loss of farmland. Loss of farmland to sprawling residential and commercial development emerged as an issue all across the United States during the 1950s. Many states gave financial incentives to farmers who continued agricultural production starting then and continuing throughout the 1960s. But in the late 1960s and early 70s, a number of concerns manifest. Financial incentives didn't appear to be working. If you own farmland on the fringe of a rapidly developing metropolitan area, selling that land for residential and commercial development was far more lucrative than whatever tax break, even if there was a penalty associated with tax incentives, was available. A lot of people were saying there were technological limits on increasing agricultural productivity. And then, at this point in time, again, late 60s, especially early 1970s, the United States is experiencing a balance of payments crisis. Oil prices are skyrocketing, and there's a lot of growing appreciation of the role of agricultural exports in addressing balance of payments problems. And so these were factors, again, encouraging people to focus on what's happening with regard to the supply of farmland. So to take the story briefly to Oregon, the Oregon legislature began to carve a path in the early 1960s that linked property tax breaks for farmland owners to the designation of exclusive farm use zones by counties to implement county land use plans. It was a Greenbelt Law in 1961. It was broadened in 1963. But one thing that's interesting to keep in mind here, the legislature itself creates an exclusive farm use zone, links it to a plan, because in Oregon, implementing ordinances like zoning ordinances need to be consistent with land use plans. However, at this point in time, 1960s, most Oregon counties are very reluctant to plan and zone. You have to remember that it was voluntary at this point in time. The state enabled cities and counties to plan, but it was up to those local governments to choose to do so, and most had not chosen to do so through the 1960s. So increasing concern about the loss of farmland, increasing costs associated with supplying infrastructure to serve a sprawling pattern of development, the degradation of water, air, and scenic natural areas. And again, these are things that are happening throughout the United States. But in Oregon, they lead to the passage of Senate Bill 10 in 1969. And an Oregon State University agricultural extension agent, Ted Sidor, played a very critical role in bringing awareness to legislators, to planners around the state about what was happening with regard to the loss of farmland and the costs of supplying infrastructure to sprawling development. And so Senate Bill 10 emerges, and this is really, of course, important, from the agriculture committees. Historically very powerful, very conservative committee, and it includes mandates to plan and zone, so getting passed enabling acts and a voluntary choice too, mandating planning and zoning. Oregon was the first state to mandate zoning in the country. A date was given in the law. You got to get those plans and zones done by the end of 1971. The governor's office was authorized to take over planning and zoning if a local government failed to meet the deadline, a pretty remarkable thing for the legislature to include. There were 10 goals in Senate Bill 10 to guide the governor's office should it decide to take over local planning and zoning. And again, interestingly, reflecting the time period, a notion of carrying capacity was one of those goals that was set out in Senate Bill 10. Okay, so we bring the Oregon story up to 1969, and now federal planning requirements and related land use initiatives. Now, this is really important to appreciate the role of the federal government in telling governments, they will need to do plans. So regional councils of governments review local government applications for federal money for consistency with regional plans. So starting in the mid-1960s, a little earlier with regard to transportation planning, the federal government starts to say, if we are going to give you money, that's again an interesting period of time when the federal government is giving an awful lot of money for infrastructure and services all across the United States. If we're going to give you money, we want to have some confidence that the money we give you isn't going to be wasted, so we want you to make plans. We want you at a higher level of authority to review local applications for project grants in the context of a regional plan. So there's an explosion of mandates to plan coming from the federal level aimed at regions, land use plans, highway and transit project plans, housing, including government-assisted housing, air quality, water and sewer projects, open space, law enforcement, health facilities. For example, there's a 1965 comprehensive health planning law. So the federal government is creating a context for plans, a requirement for plans in order to deal with its concern that left to their own devices, many local governments are putting forward requests for project funds that may not be appropriate in an overall regional context. A couple that were especially important to Oregon during this time, the Coastal Zone Management Act of 1972. Money to produce and implement the Coastal Zone Management Plan was critically important for the Oregon statewide program. Planning money and then money to implement those plans was really important in the evolution of the statewide land use planning. And we almost had a National Land Use Policy Act. Senator Henry Jackson, Washington, was the leading sponsor of the National Land Use Policy Act, and Governor McCall strongly, very strongly advocated congressional passage because it would mean money to plan for Oregon and federal support for politically controversial state and local land use changes. So again, the federal government is doing things that are creating a supportive context. When we looked at the kind of regional planning that was getting done, similar metropolitan form objectives were appearing in regional plans across the United States and in other countries. The picture is the National Capital Region Plan, Washington, D.C., 1961, and it was a very influential plan all across the United States during the 1960s. In line with what was happening around the country, the two most prominent metropolitan form alternatives being discussed in the Portland metropolitan area starting in the mid-60s were known locally as radial corridors in regional cities. So the picture reflects the radial corridor notion. So transport corridors, including especially high-capacity transit corridors, radiating out from the center, with concentrated development at particular nodes along those corridors. That was the way many, many regional planning agencies in the country were developing their plans. In addition to all the planning mandates coming out from the federal government, coming down from the federal government, a very widespread conversation was going on about new relationships between state and local governments. A couple key texts. One is The Quiet Revolution in Land Use Control, prepared for the U.S. Council of Environmental Quality in 1971, and had chapters on a whole range of innovative land use related developments around the country. You see a list there. The picture is something that was developed for the San Francisco Bay Conservation and Development Commission. And BCDC clearly influenced the Oregon Coastal Conservation and Development Commission that was legislated into existence in 1971. So again, this text is talking about the new relationship between state and local governments in the land use field. A second key text, again reflecting a much broader conversation, was a model land development code. And this was being developed by the American Law Institute, associated with the American Bar Association. And there were three ideas articulated in the evolving Model Land Development Code. One was activities of critical statewide significance. Another was areas of critical statewide concern, and then developments of regional impact. The picture is a Florida example where that state in 1972 legislated into existence a couple of these ideas. So again, the notion was the state is going to play a much more directive role in the land use planning field in relation to local governments. In Oregon, obviously the state is going to move in that direction as well, but here a path had already been carved, going back to the early 1960s and to this point through Senate Bill 10. Governor McCall argued that Senate Bill 10 had provided the framework for land use planning in Oregon and had made planning and zoning clean words. The legislature had taken the heat off local officials, several of whom suffered recall over planning and zoning decisions. So the notion of making planning and zoning clean words reflected the fact that there was a great deal of resistance, especially for zoning, throughout much of Oregon, especially in rural Oregon during this period. But the way McCall frames it is especially interesting. The legislature had said, you must do this. And so you see what's evolving here. The locals could say to people who were in opposition to those mandates, they are making us do it. The legislature is making us do it. Although in some cases it cost local officials their seats in office. This is the way Senator Hector McPherson thought about it. Counties were doing their own things. Some of them were doing a fairly good job. Others were doing a lousy job. It was time to get some statewide standards set up to make a more credible job of the planning process. And so what McPherson did was he put together a couple of study committees in 1972. One about agricultural stuff, the other about land use policy. And his study group, composed of people from the governor's office, environmental activists, academics, industry people, and others, they read those texts. They read the Quiet Revolution. They read a model land development code. They talked about those ideas. I think this is a really interesting quote from McCall, again, to express his thinking. He's got here a theory of human nature and a theory of intergovernmental relations. This is what he said to a congressional committee in 1973 when Congress was debating the National Land Use Policy Act. The closer you get to the grassroots, the harder it is to do these things that you can do more easily as a state or as the federal government, because of the parochialism and whipsawing that comes when the neighbors don't want to do this to old Tom, and they all meet in the election club, and they are all friends. So we need a strong sort of Damocles that the federal government can provide. When some county commissioners do some things under state law that are unpopular, they can blame it on the governor, and the governor can blame it on the feds. It's sort of convenient. They say, this is what they ordered us to do. It gives you leverage in trying to do something that ought to be done. So, Senate Bill 100, National Planning Landmark designated by the American Planning Association, Hector McPherson, Citizen Planner of the Year, mandated local planning and zoning that had to be acknowledged by a new state agency as consistent with statewide planning goals. So you see the link to Senate Bill 10. The mandate is carried forward. Senate Bill 10 didn't set up a new state agency to provide oversight, so we have that. The reference to statewide planning goals. So those goals are going to make it into Senate Bill 100 on an interim basis. A time certain to complete, 1 year after goal adoption. They were thinking that, well, they've already been doing some planning. It shouldn't take that much longer to whip these new plans into shape. Didn't turn out to be quite that way. Like in Senate Bill 10, but with a change, LCDC authorized to take over planning and zoning if a local government is unwilling or unable to get it done by the deadline. And then parts of Senate Bill 100, which are taken directly from those national level conversations and federal mandates. Senate Bill 100 created regional district planning councils that would coordinate city and county planning processes and review local plans and regulations for compliance with LCDC goals before submission to LCDC for review. So a regional level entity that would play a strong coordinating role. As originally introduced, SB 100 contained a lengthy list of areas of critical statewide concern, a list of activities of critical statewide significance that the state agency was authorized to regulate and for which it was authorized to issue permits. However, neither areas of critical statewide concern nor activities of critical statewide significance were designated in SB 100 as amended and passed. Required regional coordination was eliminated. Counties were assigned a coordination role. However, unlike in Hawaii, Vermont, and Florida, the three other states that had stepped in, had legislated statewide land use planning, LCDC would not produce a state plan. They were required to produce state plans. It didn't appear to be working out too well in those cases. Folks here thought there's no way we're doing a state plan, so Senate Bill 100 didn't go there. So that's Senate Bill 100. Social and political movements. So the cover is a very important book for the environmental activists who are focused on land use issues. Ian McHarg's Design with Nature was a key text. Active in Oregon during the late 1960s, early 1970s, some of the key environmental related organizations: Oregon Environmental Council, the Oregon Student Public Interest Research Group. My colleague Professor Nelson was a member, an active member of OSBRG when he was a student at Portland State. Northwest Environmental Defense Center, Steve Shell played a key role in getting this going. Sierra Club, they were reading Ian McHarg. Ian McHarg came to Oregon during this period, made a very, very big impression. Just to move his work forward a little bit, he promoted the overlay technique as a way of identifying land suitability for different uses. And of course, that evolves into geographic information systems technology, which has transformed the practice of urban planning and regional planning around the world. A link between an environmental movement and a growing women's movement. So Senate Bill 10 goes over to the House. Nancy Faley is chair of the House Environment and Land Use Committee during that session. She recalls the environment was seen as a women's issue. So an interesting crossover among social movement activism. Another movement, advocacy planning. Planners, especially those coming out of graduate programs during the latter 1960s and early 70s, they support communities resisting displacement by freeways and urban renewal projects. They strongly support increasing the supply of affordable housing, and they have a particular problem with something that was widespread all across suburban America: exclusionary zoning. Professional planning leaders worried that recent graduates of planning programs wouldn't go to work for suburban jurisdictions because they were going to be told, we want you to write and implement exclusionary zoning ordinances, and they didn't want to do that. Interest in social and economic equity amongst this new generation of advocacy planners. They're of course interested in environmental protection, a great deal of crossover there. And I thought it was fun for me to discover in the archives. There's back and forth between B.J. Rogers, a former Springfield mayor and leader of the Oregon Association of Realtors, a dialogue between Rogers and L.B. Day, founding LCDC chair. So Rogers says today, most planners have never done anything except go to school and work for the government. And unfortunately, the same was true of their teachers. Well, he had it right in my case. That was my trajectory. Why should they care if their plans bring an entire industry to a halt and in the process price the average working man out of the market? He went on to tell L.B. Day, that's L.B. Day, quite frankly, planners and planning have and continue to give us the best forum for keeping the attention of our people. I must confess to you that we will probably continue to pick on them in some fashion far into the foreseeable future. If this effort shows them to be too sensitive or too thin-skinned, then you may have more of a problem than we will. And L.B. Day told him, well, that kind of demagogic rhetoric isn't really in place in Oregon, but he assured him that his own hide was well thickened. So he welcomed that sort of engagement. Another very important social and political movement, public interest law, inspired by Ralph Nader. So here's Nader outside the Capitol. National organizations were funded by the Ford Foundation. One leading example, the Natural Resources Defense Council, which included Oregonians among its founders. Hector McPherson says, every public body needs a counterforce, and one specializing in land use is most needed at this time. Henry Richmond tells Governor McCall, we are convinced that Oregon now needs a statewide, full-time, professionally staffed citizen organization whose sole purpose is to urge state and local bodies of government to make good land use planning decisions. Thousand Friends of Oregon, established in 1975 as a land use rather than an environmental organization. It seems to me an interesting distinction with a difference, that Richmond insisted from the very beginning that it's a land use organization rather than an environmental one. Thousand Friends then was talking about growth management rather than a uniformly oppositional stance. So it's not just saying no. And Thousand Friends then led a widespread reorientation by environmental organizations interested in land use issues around the country in the direction of growth management. And that approach facilitated strategic alliances with farmers, home builders, other industry leaders, and planners. You see the headline there of an early Thousand Friends newsletter, Prospects for Federal Land Use Planning Dim. That was really a crushing blow to McCall in Oregon. That money was in the budget. It was already planned to be spent. And when it didn't show up, it was painful here. Another citizen empowerment is another very important movement. That's Jane Jacobs, author of one of, if not the most influential book for urban planners, The Death and Life of Great American Cities. And there she is defending Washington Square Park in Greenwich Village, New York, from the bulldozer. So a new generation of civic activists aim to transform the dynamics of urban development. They form neighborhood associations, and many run for and often win local and state elections. Early on, they're involved in community action organizing under the War on Poverty, and then model cities. Homeowner associations, especially in suburban areas, also become active. Here in Oregon, there's very, very strong support for public involvement in plan making and implementation. That's Dorothy Anderson, one of the founding members of the commission. She was a leader in the League of Women Voters. And the League of Women Voters was extremely active and pushing forward public involvement in planning and plan implementation. And things were happening in Portland, in Eugene, and elsewhere. On the ground, folks getting involved in a variety of ways. So here's the goals. Citizen empowerment clearly influences goal 1. It's a reason why it gets top billing among the first set of 14 that were adopted at the end of 1974. Goal 10, again, clearly demonstrating a relationship with these movement activities. Attempts to prohibit exclusionary zoning here. Goal 12, the transportation goal, again, reflecting environmentalist concern, aims to reduce principal reliance on the automobile. Goal 13, energy conservation. We almost had a carrying capacity goal and a shorelands protection goal. Again, key objectives among environmental activists and people in the public interest law movements. Fell off the table at the very end of the process. The agricultural lands and urbanization goals and their integrated implementation reflect substantial movement influence. And again, the integrated implementation of those two goals was the core innovation of the Oregon Planning Program during its early years. And the rest of the goals also manifest influences coming from those movements. A couple of extensions. There's another bill in 1973, Senate Bill 769, which transformed one of those regional councils of governments that were brought into being to deal with federal mandates in the 60s. So CRAG, the Columbia Region Association of Governments, was reconfigured by Senate Bill 769, and it embodied much of what Senate Bill 100, as introduced and strongly supported by Governor McCall and co-sponsors McPherson and Halleck, aimed to achieve. It had all those critical areas and activities, all that sort of stuff where authorities given to CRAG. CRAG's regional planning and implementation powers, in conjunction with LCDC's goals, position CRAG to more effectively address urban sprawl-related problems than any other metropolitan agency in the country. And again, people were watching not only state-level stuff, but CRAG, because of what it was able to do on paper. It was able to do practice is another story. State-level interest in establishing growth management programs wanes in 1975 and thereafter. So while there was a burst of activity, late 60s, early 70s, that's going to settle down. And Oregon is going to be pretty much alone in what it's doing for the next several years. Governor Straub's support for a substantial amount of money to implement SB 100 during an economic downturn, which had been what was happening 1973 to 1975, was crucial for the survival of the statewide land use planning program. Among the problems with Senate Bill 10, it was an unfunded mandate. No money for the locals to do anything, no money for an oversight entity. 73 to 75, stagflation. First oil crisis, rapidly rising prices, high levels of inflation, but also serious economic downturn. For the state of Oregon, again, supported strongly by Straub, to come up with a substantial budget to get Senate Bill 100 implemented was critically important. And my sense is if it hadn't happened, if there hadn't been a substantial amount of money allocated in 1975, both for the agency and for local governments to plan and zone, it would have went away right then and there. However, while Straub supported the overall level requested by the LCD for the 75-77 biennium, the budget shifted money away from Straub, the governor's office, and the legislature, shifted money away from agency programs to work on critical areas and activities, carrying capacity in a regional context, and the development of a state growth policy, and towards financial support for local comprehensive planning. So again, in the early years, LCDC wanted to go back to several of those authorities that had been taken out of Senate Bill 100. The governor's office and the legislature said, no, everything's going to depend on local comprehensive planning and then state oversight. And I think that actually set the agency, LCDC, on a different path than it had wanted to take at that time. So that's it. Thank you very much.